Hello my friends, this is John Edward Willie, and I am taking a walk on this beautiful Sunday evening, thinking about an essay that I've been writing most of the evening, which is called Where the Body Lives. And Where the Body Lives is an essay celebrating the body as well as other things that in many ways can contain that celebration, which might mean specifically the dance floor. So, believe it or not, I'm connecting the dance floor to the written page as much as I'm connecting it to what I'm doing right now, which is in many ways performative. And in many ways, what a DJ does is perhaps the most apt parallel to what it is that I've discovered myself to be doing in my reading and studying, as well as in my writing and in these videos, which is not merely doing what like a radio DJ does, which is simply performing records, but doing what a turntablist does, doing what a mixmaster does. That is, I've discovered myself to be a DJ in the world of concepts. That is, I'm a mixmaster in the life of ideas. I'm sort of a turntablist in the intersection of conversation, thinking, and speaking. That is, I myself am the living embodiment of what is reductively called the postmodern. And so in many ways, this essay is a revitalization of the so-called postmodern, perhaps as being an incorrect word, but perhaps being in the right direction insofar as the ability to suspend one's own presence in the name of a collage. That is, in the name of doing what the DJ does, which is not merely playing records, but linking records together, or even doing what house and techno and hip-hop DJs do, which is cutting and scratching. And so in this essay, I'm effectively trying to do what I'm trying to do right now, which in many ways is threefold. Primarily, I'm interested in describing what it would mean to be a mixmaster or turntablist in the life of ideas or the world of concepts. Because, I've described philosophy as being a kind of conceptual engineering, which in many ways it is. And I've made videos about beliefs, about rationality and truth and skepticism. And so much of those videos are in fact a kind of thorough examination of the inner conceptual apparatus making concepts what they are, i.e. conceptual engineering. But I also think that one must be a turntablist. That is, one must be more than a conceptual engineer. One must be performative. And so when I'm thinking and when I'm writing and even when I'm reading, I'm not operating in the way that many others do, because I see those methodologies and those attempts as being almost completely out of touch with the contemporary catastrophe. And I know that sounds extremist. It sounds almost over the top to use that word, catastrophe. But if you'll give me a chance, I hope to work my way around to not only enunciating the contemporary crisis, which can be called many different things, but the response to the crisis, I think, is precisely what the DJ as a metaphor so effectively responds to. That is, the DJ in many ways is representative for the bricoleur, or which is just a fancy French word of saying someone who can make something out of nothing. But in many ways, we speak derivatively about DIY punk culture. We speak down about the so-called postmodern without seeing that in many ways it in itself is a response to everything with nothing. Or in many ways, the postmodern happens as a theory after the fact, because I think in many ways the postmodern is responding to what in many ways is an instinctive element in people who are making something out of nothing. And so I'm, of course, trying to say too many things at once. But I think the underlying elements of what I'm speaking about are that considering the idea that the DJ as a thinker is an appropriate way of considering the autonomous individual's position in a world of endless information that's almost akin to the endless record collections of DJs, meaning that the ability to tell what is thorough and meaningful from what is superfluous or empty, that is discernment, is a key element in the DJ's life. And so when that's an element in the thinking person's life, then they begin to see other things more clearly, which is that thinking itself is performative rather than something that is spoken about, because we are bodies, and as bodies we are animated by ideas and thoughts just as much as we are by music. And so I'm sort of building on what I call the trialectic. That is, I'm sort of reconsidering what we think of as dialectic. You know, I see like Hegelian and Marxist dialectic as being completely out of touch with the natural kind of back and forth that operates between people when they're free from too many pressures, you know, and they're able to operate in a way that allows thinking to be pleasurable. But in being pleasurable, it's in fact so much more effective. And so seeing that relationship between the idea that the true trialectic, which is the way that music, there's some kind of conceptual music that comes about when two people are having a natural dialectic back and forth. The trialectic is this kind of musical thing that emerges almost like ideas for them to exist dependent upon two people thinking them at once. And so that's sort of at the heart of what I consider to be the trialectic. But the analogy with DJ culture is the crossfade, you know, because like the crossfade itself, like alternating between records, is a crucial thing in the way that like people can build a musical shape out of their differences or out of the natural back and forth, like in conversations, you know. And that's just one step in that, in the possible similes and metaphors between the two. But that's only the first of three parts. The second part has to do with seeing that DJ culture, which to me means house music that comes out of Chicago, techno from Detroit, like hip hop and garage and two-step that comes out of the UK. All of that in many ways is very similar. And what it has to do, what they all have to do in common with one another, have a lot to do in common also with the emergence of collage techniques in art, that is pastiche techniques that come out of living in a post-industrial, consumer-driven culture. So you discover that in many ways what is spoken derivatively and negatively about hip-hop and all these other like art forms like the collage, or even like Quentin Tarantino in many ways, in a very distant kind of way, is related to this, to what is seen as a kind of exhaustion of a culture. Like it's sort of seen as a dying thought and the dying art of a culture, but in many ways it's the response to a culture that's already dead. Like that's the thing about a lot of this art, is sort of reflecting a culture that in itself wants to pin it on the art. But not only is this reflective of a dead culture, but oftentimes in its more noble forms, it operates as a kind of healthy, beautiful, elegant response to emergency, to devastation. That is what I'm saying, is that dance music, house music, hip hop, that's a response to devastation. So we constantly like have the cart before the horse, you know, so to speak. And I think that prevents us from seeing the ways in which these art forms and these styles have already influenced the rest of the world in so many different ways. And of course it comes with all the shit. It's like 99% shit because it's American culture mostly. But what it is rooted in its most affirmative sense, like I'm trying to be positive about what this would mean in the way that it relates to what DJs do, can be told as a story regarding what people do when they have nothing, which is what happened in parts of Jamaica like Kingston when British colonists had left behind not musical instruments per se, but records, musical records and turntables and the Jamaicans, in the very spirit of bricolage, create what's called dub music. They create reggae in many ways already, but dub itself is the emergence of this particular kind of simulacrum that is extremely powerful, you know, because what they were doing was what happened in inner cities in many ways as a result of Reagan and others having gutted the music and art programs from elementary schools and high schools, which in many ways results in hip-hop culture attempting to use the human voice, to use the human body for all it's worth, in the most powerful sense of not responding otherwise, because there are always other socioeconomic responses other than the performative that I'm speaking about here. Now, in the back of my mind, I'm always aware of escapism. I'm always aware of that one can say that this is a failure to wrestle with actual political problems, that one is not thinking clearly about the suffering of other people, that one is mistaken to think that music or art has anything to do with that. I totally understand that, and that's so much of what I'm working against in these thoughts. It's just that I can't have every thought at once, but those represent the inherent dialectic. That it represents the inherent kind of, not confusion, but the tension between almost what appear to be opposing opposites in thought. Like, I think that being able to sustain that is precisely what the DJ, as representative of the musician, is able to sustain, which is riding on the dissonance, as it said, you know. The DJ takes a chaotic, endless world of information and crystallizes it into an experience that we get to live out, the most remarkable kind of thing. And I think that this is connected to what is a powerful way of making sense of fragments and pieces when you live in the kind of consumer-driven world that we do, which is infiltrated with advertisements and a constant bombardment of information driven by a multi-trillion-dollar industry that is wholly concentrated on taking your attention. You see that what is happening in situations where even more than that is happening, that people are doing more than superficially, in a syncretic way, putting things together, but synoptically giving birth to a whole other thing. So I'm making a distinction here between syncretic and synoptic, because syncretic is what most people do, which is that you're just putting together a whole bunch of ideas and calling it a unified thought system, or calling it your thoughts with an S. And syncretic is, in many ways, the spirit of the modern times, because even religious people don't believe in religion, but even scientific people don't believe in science. So what you find is an incredible array of contradictory notions in almost everyone you speak to. And it's not as if it were inhuman to have contradictions. Clearly, I'm a walking contradiction. But so many people's thoughts and considerations were unified by religion and state for most of our history, or it was in many ways tribal. And so this isn't terribly surprising that after all of that has broken down and we're sort of awakening in a world where people don't even believe in God, so to speak, even religious people are hedging their bets, that people would instinctively take a shortcut or a magic pill, and that is produce a superficial syncretic worldview. Because that's not what I'm speaking about. That's not what happened with disco music. That's not what happened in Chicago and Detroit and New York and Berlin and so many other places. Because what happens in these worlds is synoptic. Synoptic is the organic, spontaneous eruption of natural confluence. In other words, it's like in the middle of the night when there's a flash of lightning and you can see around for a second. That's what it's like being in a nightclub when everything is coming together and you're being swallowed whole by a kind of experience. You know, that's the thing about it, is that philosophy itself is an experience that we are living through. It's not something that happens outside of us. Our ideas are the fabric of what we are. In fact, the very warp and woof of our mental life is constructed by the yeses and the nos. That is the very warp and woof, the warp and weft, you know, the fabric, so to speak, of our mental lives is suspended within this kind of structure. And when one is deconstructing that, one can syncretically replace their broken worldview with another worldview. There's always a guru out there or a religious person who will give you a worldview. Like in our world, our consumer world, there's prepackaged ideas, prepackaged concepts that people will sell you. And because you want to believe it, like, you will believe it. But that's not the same thing as synoptical thinking, which is ruthless and grounded in a deeper kind of aspiration that some people have, which is partially an aspiration for difficulty itself. But that deep difficulty in attempting to think more and be more is related to a deeper kind of pleasure, a deeper kind of quality of experience that I think once you taste it, there's sort of no going back. Because this is precisely the human challenge. This very position that one is in when one is in catastrophe or devastation and there's nothing around you, and you have to begin telling yourself the truth, or you have the opportunity to tell yourself the truth. It's so easy not to. It's so easy to mistake another person's ideas for what you can see and what you can feel. And I think when we begin with those feelings in what Emerson called an original relationship to the world, which is very contrary to how most people think of the fact that, as they say, that no one has ever had an original idea. You know, it's very commonly said there's no such thing as an original idea. For Emerson, it happened anytime that anyone was paying attention. And I think that's a more appropriate perception, because that in itself is the very basis upon which to build a synoptic worldview. A view that is not operating with total certainty or absolutes. It's a worldview that isn't attempting to think from the outside in. It's not beginning with transcendental or meta-narratives, transcendental presuppositions or narratives, but is operating from our bodies, from our brains outward, and thinking from there, and attempting contingently and experimentally to weave narratives that can be displaced, that can be erased by the criticism of others, that's open to the falsification that's always possible for any idea. That is, these ideas ought to be tested and we live through them. And that's what a worldview has to do with. It's always, in many ways, changing with the person. And we sort of assume that it's wrong if a person changes their ideas over time. It's one of the more negative thoughts that we have that ends up really just preventing us from having thoughts at all. And so the third part, you know, after having spoken about the idea that as a writer, as a philosopher, as a reader, and even as a listener, that what I'm doing isn't merely superficially putting together the thoughts that I want to think, but attempting to bring together not only a thought, but an experience that's open to the other, so the conversation itself is as real as it gets. Not that conversation should be extreme or offensive. Of course, it should always be relaxed and easy, you know. One never wants to feel anything more than a a little bit nervous when one is speaking. That tinge is an important quality of any conversation. But I do think that we deeply normalize the way that we interact, because it's not merely that everything is so bleached out and that we're ignoring almost everything else and simply repeating what is customary and simply repeating what is our habit, rather than seeing that these habits, these routines are making precisely the world that we're wanting to reject. We see the problems as being out there. We see the issues as being in there. But all of that's wrapped up into the circular nature of our lives, which isn't circular in a negative way, but it's circular in a positive way, or it can be, because the capacity we have to see meaning in the world gives the world meaning. And in the world becoming more meaningful, we see more meaning in it. There's like an ascent. There's a positive loop that happens in that. Another way to put that is that, like, when you read a lot of poems, like I love poetry, it's sort of like one of the more important things in my life. You find that the poems breathe meaning into your life. And that as your poems bring meaning into your life in a circular way brings meaning into the poems. And I think this back and forth is a beautiful way of living. And in many ways, it's like the opposite of how most people live, which is an endless loop of pain and misery, which I don't have anything to say about, because I'm not interested in any prescriptive styled thinking or speaking. I don't think anyone can help anyone at all, really. In many ways, one of the strange miracles about human beings is that oftentimes in not being helped, we simply help ourselves. And that could be good or bad. You can help yourself in a positive way, but help yourself can also mean like stealing the silver, while the person who let you sleep there is sleeping. And so the way that we respond to that, the way that we respond to those conditions, is precisely what I mean by this third sort of section about catastrophe, and about how the collage-like techniques of a DJ-like thinker are not merely superficial, because they're indicative of the underlying human response we're capable of in emergencies. In other words, it's the devastation of an anti-gay culture. It's sort of like, in many ways, a response to the bigotry of Americans, that discotheques in the 1970s became what they were. It's not merely that gay culture is what it is, but disco itself was in many ways the embodiment of this particular kind of triumph that had to do with making something out of nothing. I'm not even politicizing it so much as what I'm suggesting is that the techniques that even hip hop as a musical form developed, that is using two records at once, spinning records, that arises precisely out of techno. Not techno, but out of disco culture. And disco culture is a human bodily response to emergency. And the history of techno as of disco, and as a movement that's related to not only what gay culture was and is, but related to the various so-called aesthetic movements that arise out of gay culture besides disco, which are like ballroom culture in New York from the 60s and 70s, and also camp culture. These are not to say that the people within these movements literally have nothing, because that's never the case universally with any movement. But I think that when there are emergent life forms, when new life forms, when forms of life are emerging, as they are more and more continuously in our world, one discovers that there's often always people inevitably in positions who are forced upon, their own autonomy, who are forced upon using whatever they have. And what we have is our body and our voice. And so whether it's like dub culture out of Jamaica, or techno that comes out of like as it sounds, mere technology, drum machines that are in Detroit, or as I mentioned with disco. But it's all obviously applicative of many other things. For instance, graffiti culture in New York. Graffiti is sort of the frustrating thing for a lot of New Yorkers, but in many ways it's an expression of a reclaiming of space and an attempt at least to not be homogenized, but instead to insist upon life as a contrary thing, if it must be, but as something that will insist upon its own voice, even if it's merely, spray can. That might be all that you have left. And again, this isn't a defense of anything that anyone is doing, but merely suggesting that what is called postmodern, and there's so many other words that one can use, is on the one hand kind of superficial and stupid. Like I said, Quentin Tarantino is sort of sometimes seen as a postmodern person, but I think that when you see the postmodern, not in that sense, but as having to do with the fundamental existential quality of people who, up against all odds, who waking up one morning in the bits and pieces of a broken world, whether it's a world of stories, like a world of concepts that no longer make sense, whether the stories their parents and culture tell them no longer make sense, or it's literal physical devastation that you're having to live on your own. That's the point at which people either begin to tell themselves the truth or they do not. And the truth, no matter what, is that there's always something to work with. And it could be that you use your body to make music. That's in fact the origination of it. It's a celebration of that particular kind of primal act. But for me, as somebody who has absolutely no talent musically, and believe me, I gave it my all. I was in a band in high school, and there was nothing I cared about more. But at one point I realized that it was sort of like a crime to make bad music when you had no talent. And I think that I sort of did the world a favor, but I'd also in many ways thought of the stage or thought of performative life in many other ways. And it's ultimately in precisely this medium, doing precisely what I'm doing right now, that all these other performative elements in myself really come together. I see myself as fourfold. That is, I read and I write and I speak and I listen. I read and write, speak and listen. And this is a speaking right now. But every day I practice a little bit at least of what I call my self-education. And I always write at least a little bit. And of course I record many videos. But the listening is, I think, the point. I think that reading books is great in itself. I love literature and poetry and philosophy and history. I love that stuff. But reading, even in its highest form, I think is a kind of practice for listening to other people. I know that sounds silly, but even listening to the world, when one is listening to the news, when one is listening to the birds in the trees. For me, because I've always already for a long time, since I was 21 or no, before that, since I was about 16, been enamored of this apparent life of the mind that existed to people who read. And what I mean to say is that this is always playing in the background so that when I'm not thinking, which I'm often not, I'm still thinking on a sort of subliminal level in a way that brings a kind of coherency into, everyday life. And this is sort of inseparable from the very act of discernment that I'd mentioned earlier, the very act of sort of telling the difference between what is superficial and what is substantial, sort of being able to tell shit from shinola. I think that originates not merely in simply paying attention, but also reading and thinking so much that the act of listening itself takes care of itself. Because, what is listening? That is the primary question. What is listening? That is, where should attention go? And I think when you're wrestling with catastrophe, when one is pulling from the very depths of one's own self, that is, pulling from two different rivers, one that goes into Athens and one that goes into Jerusalem, when you're not merely wanting to tell yourself a lie or make up a syncretic story about the situation you're in, but you're wanting to face the reality that you're in, which might mean that you have nothing and you believe in nothing, it would behoove you to also imagine that pulling from within yourself meant reading the greatest books that had ever been written, because in doing that, you are allowing yourself to hear the greatest thoughts that have ever been thought. And I don't think this is relegated to philosophy at all. I think it's in many ways not even related to the literary and as I mentioned, historical and otherwise political and economic text. And nor is it merely related to exploring, for instance, Chinese and Indian literary and philosophical and religious works, or even exploring world mythology. All of that is secondary to the immediacy and fullness of actual life, which we all see. But the irony is that, not the irony, but the effect of throwing oneself into this depth is that you return to your experience with a particular kind of clarity that you otherwise wouldn't have. And this is something people who read a lot of poems, this is something they know deeply. This is why they read poems. And short stories, for instance, like the short story form is more suitable than the novel, and in many ways gives the kind of experience that is inseparable to that particular art form. And I love a really good history book that's clearly written. And I turn away to reality, not thinking about history, but over time, this kind of osmosis opens up the particular in one's experience. What I find to be a loop in human experience is the loop between the specific and the general. In many ways, that's like a fundamental philosophical problem. It's called the nominalist dilemma. And the nominalist dilemma is we don't know if the particular or the general is more real. And in many ways, no one really thinks that either is real, but we often tend to assume that the general is more real, that the idea, the concept, the theory is more real than the thing. And yet the specificity of things, the singularity of people, is precisely where concepts and narratives and generalities come tumbling down, And so in many ways, being able to operate in a post-catastrophic world without giving into cynicism, or as I've called it, syncretic thinking, it means operating in a way that's pulling from the very depths of our culture and our history. And I think that, like, in relation to DJ culture, that's sort of like digging. For DJs, at least DJs who are old school, who use vinyl, a significant part of their life is digging up old records. And I love the concept of digging, which is someone who's going through warehouses and old houses, going through everything in order to find a gem, in order to find a record that no one has heard before. And it's really marvelous because they rediscover these things that otherwise would have been missed. And they have a corollary to the humanist scholars who for the longest time, and to this day, would scour the earth looking for books that hadn't yet been transcribed or republished. That very urge to dig through like an archaeologist would is something that I feel as a thinking person who's always digging into the ways in which our mental life is burying presuppositions, or we often have hidden ideas or narratives that are sort of like the basis of what we think, that requires a kind of shovel that is a sort of deconstructive maneuver in order to open up. And that deconstructive maneuver is sort of the way in which a DJ, as a priestly character, as a shamanistic form, which is what the archetype of the DJ is, that's precisely what they're doing. And so they're decentering and centering culture itself through the performative act of creating a experience for the dancers. And that is what it's about, the dancers. And so you can see dancing as a response to devastation. You know, it's not merely a form of escape or a way of denying suffering. It's a way of affirming life that exists, life as it is. And the recovery of the body is instrumental to the recovery of the soul, because the body is the soul. You know, if the soul exists, then it would have to be that obvious. And it certainly is. And the body is recovered in dance music's perennial democratic spirit, which denies no one, you know. It's almost like the modern dance floor, whether it's in Chicago or it's in Berlin or South America or Japan, is sort of like the resurgence of the Eastern Orthodox Church in its sort of defense of absolutely everyone, and its sort of refusal to say that anyone is absolutely condemned. You know, there's something like that happens in the way that people are almost anonymously brought back to life, you know, as a kind of response to everything else around them, specifically the vacuous, bodiless, abstract, ethereal, hyper-real, you know, postmodern state that people live in. So it's almost like the DJ, and what the DJ does is the authentic form of what postmodernism mirrors. Because what I'm even attempting to do here is to do exactly what the DJ does. You know, this whole recording and every recording that I do, my attempt is not merely analytical or conceptual. My attempt is to create an experience for my listeners. And I see what I'm doing not merely as the attempt to create an experience, but as sort of like the basis for imagining what I call the trialectic, which is what happens when two thinking people come together and have a really great conversation. You know, I think that kind of experience is something that is pulling from the very best of our traditions. It's pulling from the very best of our past, as I said, from the deepest rivers of who we are. But it's also wanting to improvise and wanting to respond to the immediate existential urgency of our lives, which cannot be explained away, because there is no model for your life. There is no pre-made story that fits who you are. That involves like your own courage. So that's where philosophy isn't merely even about conceptualization or even about the performative elements of a DJ-like response to catastrophe, but it might even mean something more. But I'm John Edward Willie, and I love you guys. You know I love doing this. I'm hoping to put these essays up on Substack in the very near future, so you can check out my Substack to see this essay.